You wake up before dawn. Your hands are steady, but your stomach is tight. You eat a small breakfast, but you barely taste it. You dress carefully, putting on clean clothes, because that is part of the ritual. Then you walk through empty streets to a place most people will never see. When you arrive, a crowd is already gathering. They are loud, excited, waiting for a show. But you are not here to entertain them. You are here to do a job. You check your tools. The rope is new and strong. The platform is secure. The trap door opens smoothly. Everything is ready. A guard brings the condemned person to you. They are shaking. Some beg. Some pray. Some say nothing at all. You do not speak to them. You cannot afford to see them as human. You place the noose around their neck. You tighten it. You step back. You pull the lever. And in an instant, a life ends. You are paid by the government. You are following the law. But everyone who looks at you sees a killer. This was reality in Britain and America throughout the 1700s and 1800s, a period when public execution was considered both justice and entertainment. Crime rates were high, and the legal system responded with brutal efficiency. Stealing property worth more than a shilling could result in a death sentence. Murder, rape, treason, arson, and even minor offenses were punishable by hanging. Courts sentenced hundreds of people to death every year, and someone had to carry out those sentences. Executioners were employed by local governments or regional authorities. The job was legal, necessary, and permanent. But it came with a cost that destroyed nearly every man who took it. Society needed executioners to maintain order and enforce laws, but it hated them for doing exactly what it demanded. They were essential and despised at the same time. Most executioners lived in isolation, shunned by their communities, haunted by the deaths they caused, and trapped in a role they could never escape. His name was Richard. He was 31 years old when he became an executioner. He had worked as a blacksmith for most of his adult life, but an injury to his back made it impossible to continue heavy labor. He had a wife and 3 children to support, and no skills that translated to other work. When the previous executioner in his county died, the position was announced publicly. The pay was steady, and it included a small house provided by the local government. Richard was desperate. His family was weeks away from being evicted. He had no other options. So he applied. The authorities asked him only one question during the interview. Could he do what was required without hesitation? Richard said yes. He did not know if that was true, but he needed the job. They hired him immediately. His wife cried when he told her. She understood what it meant. Their neighbors would turn against them. Their children would be bullied. But they would survive. That was all that mattered. Richard reported for his first execution 3 days later. The process was methodical. Richard arrived at the prison early in the morning. He inspected the gallows, testing the rope, checking the trapdoor mechanism, making sure the platform was stable. Hangings could go wrong in terrible ways. If the rope was too long, the condemned person could be decapitated. If it was too short, they would strangle slowly instead of dying quickly. Richard had been trained by the outgoing executioner's assistant, but training could only prepare him so much. The condemned man was brought out in chains. He was young, maybe 25, sentenced to death for armed robbery. He was terrified. Richard could see it in his eyes, in the way his legs barely supported him. 2 guards held him upright and walked him up the steps to the platform. The crowd below was shouting, some cheering, some jeering. Richard placed the noose around the man's neck and adjusted it carefully. His hands were shaking, but he forced them to stay steady. The man whispered something Richard could not hear. Richard did not ask him to repeat it. He stepped back, gripped the lever, and pulled. The trapdoor opened. The man dropped. The rope went taut. His body jerked once, then went still. It was over in seconds. Richard felt nothing at first, just emptiness. But that night, when he closed his eyes, he saw the man's face. He saw the moment the trap opened. He saw the body hanging, and he realized this was only the beginning. Over the following months, Richard executed 17 more people. Men, women, young and old. Each one was different. Some faced death with dignity. Others screamed and fought. Some collapsed and had to be carried to the gallows. Richard learned to detach himself emotionally. He stopped looking at their faces. He stopped listening to their words. He focused only on the mechanics of the job. Check the equipment, secure the noose, pull the lever, move on. But detachment came at a cost. He stopped feeling much of anything. At home, his wife tried to talk to him, but he had nothing to say. His children were afraid of him. Neighbors no longer greeted his family. Shopkeepers served them reluctantly, if at all. The local priest refused to give Richard communion, saying he was stained by the blood of the condemned. Richard's wife begged him to find other work, but there was no other work. They were trapped. The job paid enough to survive, but it destroyed everything else. Richard became a ghost in his own community. People crossed the street to avoid him. Parents told their children to stay away from his house. Other workers refused to stand near him. He was legally employed by the government, doing exactly what the law required, but he was treated as if he were cursed. The isolation was suffocating. Richard began drinking to silence his thoughts. It helped briefly, but the images always returned. He started having nightmares. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced he could hear the sound of the trapdoor opening. His wife stopped sleeping in the same bed. His children stopped speaking to him. He was alone, even in his own home, surrounded by the ghosts of the people he had killed. Think about that. Imagine being hired by the government to do something legal, something society demands, and then being hated for it. Imagine doing your job exactly as required and being treated like a monster. Could you live with that? Could you carry out executions knowing that every single person you meet will despise you for it? And if you were desperate enough to take that job, how long could you last before it broke you? The job carried physical dangers as well. Crowds at executions were unpredictable. If the condemned person was popular or the execution was controversial, the crowd could turn violent. Richard had stones thrown at him twice. Once, a group of men tried to storm the platform to stop an execution. Guards had to intervene, and Richard barely escaped injury. Botched executions were even worse. One time, the rope snapped during the drop. The condemned man fell to the ground, injured but alive. Protocol required Richard to hang him again immediately. But the man was screaming, begging for mercy, and the crowd was furious. Richard had to drag him back up the stairs and finish the job while people shouted threats at him. That night, Richard vomited until there was nothing left in his stomach. He sat alone in his kitchen, shaking, unable to stop seeing the man's face. But he returned to work the next week because he had no choice. But here is what most people do not know. Executioners were sometimes required to torture condemned prisoners before execution. In cases of treason or particularly severe crimes, the sentence included public torture. Richard was ordered to flog prisoners, to burn them with hot irons, or to mutilate them before hanging. These were legal sentences approved by judges and carried out under government authority. Richard had no option to refuse. If he did, he would lose his job and likely face prosecution himself. So he did what was ordered. He whipped men until their backs were shredded. He applied branding irons to flesh, and every time the crowd watched. Some cheered, some looked away, but no one stopped it. And Richard carried the weight of every scream, every moment of agony, for the rest of his life. The law said it was justice. Richard knew it was torture, but he had no power to change it. Now think about this. Your justice system today still carries out executions in some places. People are still hired to do it. They use different methods now, injections instead of ropes, but the role is the same. Someone has to do it. Someone has to end a life because the government decided that person deserves to die. Do you think the people who carry out modern executions struggle the way Richard did? Do you think they are haunted, or has society found a way to make killing feel clean? Most executioners did not last more than a decade. The psychological toll was too severe. Some became alcoholics. Others went insane. A few killed themselves. Richard lasted 8 years. By the end, he was barely functional. He drank constantly. He stopped maintaining his appearance. He stopped caring about anything. His wife had left him, taking the children. He lived alone in the small house, provided by the government, surrounded by empty bottles and memories he could not escape. He still showed up for executions because it was the only thing he knew how to do. But he was hollow. There was nothing left inside him. Just the mechanical repetition of a job that had consumed him completely. Richard's final execution was in the autumn. The condemned man was older, in his 50s, sentenced for murder. Richard went through the motions. He checked the equipment. He placed the noose. He pulled the lever. But this time, something broke inside him. He watched the body drop and he felt nothing. Not relief, not guilt. Just emptiness. He walked off the platform, left the prison, and went home. That night, he sat in his kitchen with a pistol he had bought years earlier. He thought about his wife, his children, the life he had lost. He thought about the faces of the people he had executed. He thought about the man who had whispered something Richard never heard. And then he made a decision. Richard's body was found the next morning. There was no funeral, no mourning. The government hired a new executioner within a week. The work continued, and Richard became just another casualty of a job that destroyed everyone who did it. Society needed executioners to enforce its laws. It needed someone willing to kill on its behalf so that everyone else could pretend their hands were clean. The courts sentenced people to death. The government approved it. The public attended and watched, but the executioner carried the moral weight. He was the one who actually ended the life. And for that, he was hated. The system required his service and punished him for providing it. Richard was not an evil man. He was a desperate man who took the only job available and paid for it with his sanity, his family, and eventually his life. He did exactly what society asked him to do, and society destroyed him for it. There were hundreds of executioners like Richard throughout history. Most of them died broken, alone, and forgotten. Their names are not remembered. Their suffering is not acknowledged. They were necessary and invisible at the same time. The legal execution system eventually changed. Hangings became less public. Executioners were given more training and psychological support, but that took generations. The men who worked before those changes were made suffered in silence. Richard was one of them. He killed because he was hired to kill. He was paid by the government. He followed the law, but the law did not protect him from the consequences. It did not protect him from the nightmares, the isolation, or the guilt. It just demanded that he keep working until he could not anymore. And when he finally broke, no one cared. They just replaced him and moved on. Richard is gone now. The gallows where he worked have been torn down. The prison no longer exists, but the question he represents remains. What happens to the people society hires to do the things everyone else refuses to do? What happens to the person who pulls the lever, who administers the injection, who carries out the sentence? Do they become monsters? Or were they just ordinary people placed in an impossible situation? And if we need someone to do that job, are we responsible for what it does to them? Richard did not have answers to those questions. He just did the work until it killed him. And if you think being an executioner was the darkest job society ever created, you would be wrong. There were others. Jobs that required even more from the people who did them. Jobs that destroyed not just individuals, but entire families. And some of those jobs still exist in forms we do not talk about.